Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. July 11th, 1981, San Jose, California. The city had grown fast. Industrial sprawl pushing up against farmland, train lines slicing through weeded lots. Nothing moved on the strip of field near Maburi Road except a lone maintenance worker clearing debris behind a chain-link fence. At 9:32 a.m., dispatchers at San Jose PD received a call to 911. The caller didn't say much, just 5 words according to the transcript. "I found something in the field." Responding officers arrived within 7 minutes. The caller, a contracted field maintenance worker, was waiting by the roadside, visibly pale, refusing to return to the area without backup. He led detectives roughly 300 feet into overgrown brush and stopped cold beside a shallow indentation in the soil. What lay there wasn't a body. Not completely. It was a torso, no head, no arms, no legs. Fully clothed from the chest down, the upper half of a black female adult lay curled slightly to one side, partially concealed by tall grass. The decomposition was advanced but not extensive, consistent with a death occurring within 3.5 days. No insects. No immediate blood spatter nearby. The body had been moved. Officers secured the perimeter. The evidence log from that morning listed 3 critical findings within the immediate vicinity. A silver chain with a crucifix, located 19 inches from the torso. A small religious medal featuring an image of the Virgin Mary, partially buried. A swatch of pale fabric, not consistent with the victim's clothing, clinging to a nearby bush. No identification, no purse, no car, no tire tracks of note. Just a body segment left behind with surgical precision. The coroner arrived shortly after noon. Preliminary observations noted clean dismemberment at both shoulder joints and lower hips. No tool marks were identifiable on scene. No ID came from fingerprints. No match in the California State Database or National Missing Persons Index. That became its own problem. The system couldn't identify someone it had never documented missing. The remains were bagged and transported to the Santa Clara County Medical Examiner's office. Lead coroner Dr. Helen Parker conducted the external and internal exam over the next 48 hours. According to her full report, the cause of death was not dismemberment. The woman had died from multiple stab wounds to the upper chest, inflicted with a single-edged blade. The pattern suggested aggression, not ritual. 3 of the 7 wounds had penetrated vital organs. There were no defensive wounds on the remaining torso, no indications of restraint, ligature marks, or bruising from impact. The skin showed minor abrasions consistent with transport post-mortem. The killer had moved her. But from where? The torso was preserved. A clay reconstruction of her face was later attempted using anthropological estimates. Mid-50s, African-American heritage, possibly Southern origin, had at least one child based on pelvic morphology. Height, eye color, voice, personality, all absent. Even her name was missing. She became Jane Doe, 810711. Flyers went out across San Jose. Local media covered the case for 2 nights. KTVU aired a 30-second segment showing a sketch of the reconstructed face with the hotline number beneath. But no tips came in. No family stepped forward. No church member called. She disappeared again. This time not physically, but from the public eye. The field where she was found would later be flattened to make way for a parking lot. A small corner of that asphalt now rests under the Berryessa BART station. The case file was sealed, then shelved, but not closed. The victim's remains were processed, logged, and stored under case ID Jucker 81711, classified as an unidentified homicide victim. With no leads from the immediate scene, the investigation shifted to building a profile from the remains. That began in the morgue. Santa Clara County forensic anthropologist Dr. Linda Reyes conducted the secondary analysis. Measurements of the femur and pelvis, what was available, suggested a woman approximately 5 or 4 tall. Skeletal features confirmed she was of African ancestry. Dental records revealed moderate wear consistent with someone in her 50s. She had prior dental work, but nothing traceable to a specific provider. There was no indication of childbirth in the medical examiner's original notes, but Reyes identified subtle morphological traits, pelvic spacing, lumbar curvature, consistent with women who had given birth. She annotated possible parity, 1 to 2 children. That detail remained unofficial, but was noted in the internal profile summary. The clothing offered limited help: a floral blouse and elastic waistband skirt, standard, mass-produced. No dry cleaning tags, no tailor markings. The labels had degraded due to moisture exposure. No blood was present on the outer garments, supporting the theory that the torso was cleaned or redressed before being placed at the dump site. The 2 religious medallions found near the remains were sent to the property and evidence unit. Both were inexpensive pewter alloys. One bore the Latin inscription Regina Sini Labe Originali Concepta OPN, an abbreviation for Our Lady Conceived Without Sin, Pray for Us. That phrase was consistent with Roman Catholic iconography, particularly among Black or Latino congregations in the East Bay. A potential religious affiliation, but not a traceable lead. The body's decomposition, while not extensive, offered another angle. Entomological analysis placed time of death between 72 and 96 hours prior to discovery. That narrowed the window to early July 1981, likely the weekend prior. Weather data confirmed 3 consecutive days of high humidity with minimal sun exposure. That environmental consistency explained the lack of insect activity and slowed decay. Without a name, fingerprint database entries returned 0 hits. The victim's fingers had been removed, making full fingerprinting impossible. Investigators turned to the only available biometric left: dental records. Unfortunately, in 1981, there was no national dental registry. Local dental offices were contacted manually, no matches. Missing persons reports were combed statewide. In 1981, California did not have a centralized digital MP database. Each county maintained its own. San Jose PD sent inter-county inquiries across the Bay Area. Oakland, San Francisco, Alameda, Contra Costa. They received 0 hits for Black women aged 45 and 60 gone missing between June and July of that year. This absence raised internal flags. If this was a stranger homicide, we'd expect someone to report her missing, one detective wrote in the case file margin, but nobody did. Without a name, there could be no match, and without a match, there was no starting point. The profile was broad. Black woman, late 40s to mid-50s, potentially religious, had children, but had not been reported missing anywhere in the region. She had no apparent job ties, criminal background, or medical implants that could be linked to a patient history. Years passed. The case file was labeled Unsolved Homicide, Unidentified, and placed into cold storage. Box 3174. It would stay there for more than 4 decades. Investigators moved on. The field where she had been found was flattened and repurposed. The body itself was buried under a county-issued gravestone, marked only by her file number. But not everyone forgot her. In 2023, new protocols funded by state grants allowed cold cases with unidentified victims to be reviewed for potential DNA reprocessing. Case Nardur 81-0711 was one of them. A technician logged a memo in the re-examination notes. Unidentified torso, 1981, long shot, clothing sample submitted to lab for mtDNA extraction. Consider genealogical analysis if viable. The process had begun. In early 2023, Santa Clara County launched a targeted initiative to reprocess cold cases involving unidentified homicide victims. Funding came from a combination of state grants and federal forensic backlog reduction programs. The goal was straightforward: use modern DNA techniques to identify victims whose names had been lost to time. Victims like Jane Doe, or 81711. Inside a steel filing cabinet in a secured evidence vault, Box 3174 hadn't been opened in over a decade. It contained the original crime scene photographs, coroner's notes, a sealed evidence bag with a swatch of clothing, and a typed chain of custody form now yellowed with age. The case was selected not because of new leads, but because it had viable biological material preserved under acceptable conditions. The torso's clothing had been stored dry, isolated, and undisturbed, ideal for mitochondrial DNA extraction. The lab technician who submitted the sample made a notation in the reentry log: submit for mtDNA analysis, preserve full chain, candidate for genealogical trace if result viable. The analysis was conducted at a private forensic lab under contract with Parabon Nanolabs. Initial results confirmed the presence of degraded but sequenceable mitochondrial DNA. A full mtDNA profile was constructed within 5 weeks. From there, a YSTR and autosomal profile were attempted. Although no direct match existed in CODIS, the autosomal markers were strong enough for genealogical triangulation. Parabon's analysts uploaded the genetic profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database used for law enforcement purposes under strict user consent protocols. Within 2 months, the system flagged a potential second cousin match from Arkansas. That entry had been uploaded by a woman named Cheryl Moss, who, when contacted, disclosed that her grandmother had disappeared in 1981 under unexplained circumstances. According to Cheryl, her grandmother's name was Vivian Moss. She had lived in Oakland at the time, had been active in her church, and was described as deeply private. Cheryl remembered being 6 years old and waiting at the church one Sunday evening. Vivian had promised to pick her up. She never arrived. The family didn't file a missing persons report. At the time, Cheryl's mother believed Vivian had simply left. There had been no signs of forced entry at her home, no calls from hospitals, no ransom notes. Vivian's absence, though painful, was interpreted as voluntary, a decision to distance herself from the family. In 1981, that conclusion wasn't challenged, especially not when it came to older Black women who lived independently and often outside the formal systems of employment, insurance, or digital records. Investigators cross-referenced what Cheryl had described with the original forensic profile: age, ancestry, time of death, geographic proximity. Everything aligned. The final confirmation came through kinship comparison using short tandem repeat (STR) matching, a more precise method than mtDNA. The STR results returned a 99.9999% probability that Jane Doe, 810711, was, in fact, Vivian Moss. It had taken 42 years, 3 labs, and a stranger's curiosity in building a family tree to put a name to a forgotten body. But that name was no longer just an entry on a report. It was the catalyst to reopen a dormant homicide investigation. The case file was updated. The header changed from unidentified female, 1981, to Vivian Moss, homicide active. Investigators scheduled a full re-examination of the physical evidence, beginning with the clothing preserved in box 3174. They knew the scene had been compromised by time, evidence degradation, possible contamination, and an incomplete body, but identifying the victim was more than symbolic. It changed the classification of the case. What had been a generic unsolved homicide was now legally and investigatively viable. The team began rebuilding the timeline. Vivian's last confirmed contact, her likely movements that weekend, possible relationships, past conflicts, and any public records that might indicate who she spent time with in the weeks prior to her death. They also examined whether she had ever been seen near San Jose, nearly 50 miles from her known residence. It was unclear whether she had traveled there voluntarily or was transported post-mortem. That discrepancy mattered. Voluntary movement meant the suspect could have known her well. Forced relocation suggested premeditation and planning. The renewed investigation surfaced one internal tension. For all the progress made with forensic science, the foundational questions still remained. Where had she died? How had she ended up in that field? And why had no one said anything for over 4 decades? Forensics could draw a map, but motive and opportunity required people to talk. Vivian Moss was no longer a statistic. She was a woman with family, with habits, with routines, and someone, somewhere, had erased her from them. A press release was drafted by the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office in May 2025. It read, in part, "With the identification of Vivian Moss, we are asking the public for any information regarding her disappearance or movements in July 1981. No detail is too small. They had a name. Now they needed a witness." By mid-May 2025, the case file on Vivian Moss was reclassified as active. With her identity confirmed, investigators moved quickly to reconstruct the final weeks of her life. The first step wasn't speculation or psychological profiling. It was location. Geography and pattern matter in homicide work, especially in cold cases. The victim lived in Oakland. Her torso was found nearly 50 miles south, in a lot just outside central San Jose. That gap raised the first operational question: how did she get there, and why? Detectives pulled archived DMV data from Alameda County for vehicles registered to Moss or any known relatives. Her last vehicle on file, a 1972 Oldsmobile, had been sold 2 years before her death. No active vehicle registration existed in her name. If she traveled to San Jose, someone else drove. Church records at Mount Zion Spiritual Church confirmed that Moss was last seen by fellow parishioners on Sunday, July 5, 1981. She had attended evening service, left alone around 8:15 p.m., and told one woman she'd be back later in the week for a meeting. That never happened. From a timeline perspective, this places her final sighting 72 to 96 hours before the body was discovered, precisely matching the coroner's estimate. Detectives revisited city directories and tenant registries from 1980-81, mapping a small web of personal connections. One former roommate from the 1970s, two male acquaintances listed on her church contact card, and a longtime neighbor who remembered seeing Vivian speaking with a man outside her apartment 3 days before she vanished. He described the man as mid-50s, medium build, African-American, driving a dark sedan. No name, no plate number, no report filed at the time. This new statement, though decades late, became the first external confirmation that Moss may have interacted with someone just before her disappearance. But it also introduced an investigative dilemma. Few people from her social orbit were still alive, reachable, or mentally fit for formal interviews. Memory degraded faster than evidence. Digital searches for those connected to Moss yielded few solid leads. Two of the men listed in church records were deceased. The third, an Eric L. Mitchell, had lived in San Jose in 1981 and had a misdemeanor domestic violence charge from 1979. There was no record of continued contact with Moss, and he had died in 2010. Still, his name was placed on the list of persons of potential contact, not as a suspect, but as a social reference point. Investigators then examined the location where Moss's torso was found. That lot near Mabry Road, now a BART parking structure, had previously been a stretch of underused railroad service access. In 1981, it wasn't monitored, and most of the surrounding land was either fallow or zoned for industrial transition. It was accessible, dark, and disconnected from the residential grid. That made it ideal for a body dump, but only to someone who knew the area well. That strongly suggested that the suspect had familiarity with San Jose, not just Oakland. From a behavioral standpoint, the act of dismemberment still stood out. The cuts were clean. The coroner's original notes indicated an absence of hesitation marks and a uniformity in tissue separation, something rarely seen in first-time offenders. It raised the possibility that the individual either had medical training, prior exposure to post-mortem handling, or experience with animal butchery. That detail was added to the behavioral profile under review. The timeline of events was now clear within a 96-hour window, but what remained uncertain was motive, method of transport, and, most critically, the scene of the actual homicide. Moss had not died in the field. That location was purely disposal. Investigators considered releasing a composite sketch based on witness memory of the unknown man, but the time elapsed made facial recognition unreliable. Instead, they focused on building a map, not of suspects but of opportunity. That included her routine paths, public transit access points, and community hubs where she may have last been seen. No digital records, no surveillance footage, no modern forensic cross-references, just a gap. In cases like these, where evidence is sparse and time has stripped context from everything physical, the small confirmations matter. An address remembered, a name jotted in a church ledger. Even the absence of behavior, like not showing up to a planned meeting, takes on weight. Vivian Moss had a predictable life. She did not vanish spontaneously. Someone intervened. The question now was who and whether that person had left a trace no one had seen yet. The identification of Vivian Moss changed the stakes. With her name restored, everything preserved in the original evidence vault gained new relevance. That included a single item once considered marginal, a patterned polyester blouse, folded into an airtight bag since 1981. No longer just clothing, it was now a forensic timeline. A controlled environment and correct initial handling had made it viable for reanalysis using modern trace detection methods. In April 2025, Santa Clara's Cold Case Division authorized a full reprocessing of the original garment under current trace analysis protocols. The blouse had no visible blood staining, which had raised questions during the initial autopsy. Now technicians wanted to know what else it held. Under variable pressure vacuum extraction and polarized light microscopy, lab techs identified over a dozen foreign fibers clinging to the lower back seam. Most were environmental: cotton blends, synthetic filaments from industrial dust, consistent with outdoor transfer. But three fibers were flagged for deeper analysis. They were animal in structure, tightly curled, and chemically stained. The source was narrowed to upholstery-grade wool blend, likely from a vehicle seat. Confirmed by FTIR spectroscopy, the sample composition matched a category of automotive interior material used in late 1970s American sedans. Not unique, but specific enough to be entered into a limited-use FBI database cataloging historic manufacturer material types. It returned one match: General Motors, Buick Division, 1977-1979 models, color, charcoal slate. This data point didn't reveal a name, but it supported a working theory. Vivian had been transported in a vehicle prior to disposal, and whoever drove that car had direct contact with her, or her body, within the final 24 hours. Beyond fibers, the interior fabric retained non-visible particulate. A mass spectrometry scan revealed trace amounts of oxidized oil and polyethylene micropellets, components found in commercial garbage bags during the late 1970s. Their presence indicated that the blouse had likely been enclosed in plastic at some point post-mortem. The scene at Mabury Road hadn't shown any torn bag remnants, so if a bag had been used, it was either removed deliberately or disintegrated before discovery. Either way, this added a layer of intent, concealment, and transport. Meanwhile, DNA testing of the blouse yielded minimal return. The fabric had degraded under ambient humidity before recovery. However, one fragment, drawn from a button seam, provided a degraded Y chromosome partial. It wasn't enough for identification, but confirmed the presence of male DNA in a location not expected through casual contact. Investigators mapped this against everything they had. Combined with the dismemberment precision, the transportation details, and lack of any sign of theft, the profile began to take shape. The killer wasn't impulsive. He was careful. He chose the dump site. He used materials designed to minimize detection. But he had missed a thread, literally. A second item from the original case file, once dismissed, was also revisited: the religious medals found near the torso. Lab imaging detected minute scratches on the Virgin Mary pendant, wear marks consistent with long-term skin contact, but also a more recent gouge across the back edge, likely made by metal against stone. This indicated the item had been moved or dropped with force, not gently placed. It had been disturbed, possibly during transport or disposal. These weren't details for dramatic effect. They were details that mattered. In forensic work, the absence of noise is data. The intact fabric, the localized fibers, the chemical residue, they all build a scene not of chaos, but of containment. Vivian hadn't died at the scene. She had been moved, probably in a car. The person who moved her had knowledge of containment and control, and whoever he was, he hadn't expected her blouse to carry history in its seams. In modern cold case work, this is what progress looks like. Not revelations, refinement. Following the reanalysis of the blouse in April 2025, the cold case team shifted its focus to match the trace findings with known associates from 1981. There was no fingerprint, no complete DNA profile, but there was enough physical evidence to refine their list. The detail that mattered most: the fiber match pointing to a General Motors sedan manufactured between 1977 and 1979. That category of car wasn't rare in California at the time, but pairing it with proximity to Vivian Moss's known locations, plus any history of violence, began narrowing the pool. Among the three names pulled from the old Mount Zion contact card, two had been deceased for years. The third, Eric L. Mitchell, had lived in East San Jose in 1981 and appeared briefly in public records connected to a domestic disturbance complaint. The original police report from 1979 was scanned from microfilm. No conviction, but an arrest for misdemeanor assault. The victim had declined to press charges. Mitchell's connection to Moss had never been formally established. No shared address, no co-signed leases, no joint records. But his name had come up once before, handwritten in the corner of a church note recovered from Vivian's apartment during the initial 1981 search. At the time, it had been marked irrelevant. There had been no sign she was in danger. No family had reported her missing. Now, with new forensic leads and decades of hindsight, that scrap of handwriting was reclassified as a potential pre-contact link. Investigators checked DMV records. In 1981, Mitchell had registered a 1978 Buick LeSabre in his name, charcoal slate interior, matching the fiber type found on Vivian's blouse. That vehicle was sold in 1984 and scrapped in 1991. No physical trace remained, but the records were there. They verified that Mitchell had worked as a maintenance subcontractor for a commercial pest control company based in Santa Clara County. His service areas included East San Jose and the industrial zone near Bo.dy Road. That placed him within 5 miles of the body disposal site, both geographically and professionally. His employment file listed one disciplinary note in 1980, unauthorized detour during service route. The company had no GPS logs, it was 1980, but the supervisor's notation was preserved. It wasn't criminal, but it meant he had deviated from routine during work hours. Mitchell passed away in 2010. There would be no interview, no statement, no confrontation. But investigators didn't need a confession. They needed weight. Converging lines of circumstantial data that, in cold case work, often served as the closest available proxy for truth. They compared Mitchell's timeline with Moss's. Both lived in the East Bay area during the same period. Both were active within overlapping church communities. Both had mobility. He had a car. She used public transit or occasional rides. He had access to isolated lots in San Jose. She disappeared shortly after a Sunday evening service. He owned a Buick with the exact material composition later found on her clothing. And he had, at minimum, a documented history of aggression toward women. Legally, it wasn't enough. But from a prosecutorial standpoint, it crossed the threshold of relevance. The Santa Clara County DA's office declined to label Mitchell a suspect in any official release, but his name was included in the internal lead sheet as individual of high investigative interest, deceased. The file was updated with a note. Further efforts may include public request for corroborating statements from known associates, co-workers, or relatives. Sometimes the perpetrator dies before the case catches up. That doesn't invalidate the process. In fact, it sharpens its purpose. Not every cold case ends with a courtroom. Some end by finally naming the right person, not for justice, but for history. And yet, even in death, Mitchell remained an open question. There were no witnesses placing him with Moss that weekend. No confession, no biological match. Only a sequence of indicators pointing in his direction. Still, in investigations like this, silence can speak. And enough weight leaning one way creates gravity. By May 21, 2025, the Vivian Moss case had reached a familiar point in cold case investigations. A suspect deceased, no surviving eyewitnesses, and no legal avenue for prosecution. The forensic evidence, while substantial in weight, lacked the final element necessary for criminal charge. Direct DNA confirmation or a living witness linking Eric Mitchell to the murder itself. Still, the investigation was not quietly closed. Instead, it was brought into public view. At a press conference held by the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office, a plain black and white photograph of Vivian Moss was placed beside a printed copy of her reconstructed 1981 case file. Prosecutors did not name Mitchell in their statement. They presented no theory, no accusation. What they offered was a fact. Vivian Moss had been identified and her death officially classified as a homicide by stabbing and dismemberment. The DA encouraged anyone with information about her relationships in 1981, however insignificant it may have seemed, to come forward. Behind the podium, seated quietly, was Cheryl Moss, now in her late 40s. The granddaughter who had entered her DNA into a genealogy site in 2023 had now become the living link to a woman whose memory had once vanished into bureaucratic silence. She was not there to speak for evidence, but to fill the human void often left by procedural investigations. In cases where the primary suspect has died, public outreach serves a dual function. It signals transparency, and it offers a final invitation for accountability. Investigators hope someone, former co-workers of Mitchell, old neighbors, even churchgoers from decades ago, might recall something overlooked. Not just for closure, but for confirmation. As of May 29th, no actionable leads had surfaced. The remaining challenge was institutional. How do law enforcement agencies treat a case that can't be prosecuted, but also can't be disproven? The answer in Moss's file was simple. The case would remain open but inactive. Not closed, not dismissed, just waiting. In internal debrief memos, detectives described the evidence path as logically consistent with Mitchell's involvement. The details aligned: vehicle fiber match, proximity to disposal site, unreported prior contact, documented aggression. What they lacked was admissible, living proof. Publicly, the department made no speculative declarations. Legally, it couldn't. Ethically, it shouldn't. But operationally, the investigation had run its course. In homicide work, there's a name for that outcome: unresolved with probable identification. The significance of these cases goes beyond legal terminology. Cold case units across the country face the same tension, balancing forensic certainty with the impossibility of trial. For the Moss case, the goal shifted, not toward punishment, but precision. Not to label someone a killer without due process, but to ensure Vivian wasn't lost in the system again. Her file now carried her full name, date of birth, and cause of death. Her remains, once marked by a code, had been reinterred under a proper headstone bearing her name. She was no longer Jane Doe, no longer missing, no longer unclaimed. The message embedded in that correction carried institutional weight. Every body left unidentified is not just a forensic failure, but a moral one. Vivian's case illustrated what happens when community visibility erodes, and when marginalized victims slip through cracks created by race, age, and assumptions. She was never reported missing, not because no one cared, but because the system wasn't built to look for people like her. The story's unresolved status didn't make it incomplete. On paper, there were still unanswered questions, but the greater failure would have been to ignore the evidence, to let the box remain closed, to let the woman remain a file. When justice isn't possible, recognition is what remains. In a system driven by facts and limitations, naming the dead, correctly finally, is a form of closure that matters. It's not enough, but it's more than silence. On May 23, 2025, the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office issued a final update in the Vivian Moss investigation. The case remained officially unsolved. No one would stand trial. No indictments were pending. No arrest would ever be made. And yet, for the first time in 44 years, the public record carried the name of a woman who had been buried under a number, Reader 810711, for more than 4 decades. This was not closure in the legal sense, but it was the end of something. Not the end of inquiry, but the end of anonymity. For many cold case investigators, this is the closest version of justice they'll ever write into the final line of a report. Not the conviction of a killer, but the confirmation of a life. What made Vivian's case resonate, even beyond its forensic complexity, was what it revealed about the systems around it. Vivian Moss was never reported missing. Not because no one wondered, but because in 1981 the structures in place to receive such a report were rigid, under-resourced, and culturally selective. A 54-year-old black woman living alone in Oakland, with no active employment, no recent doctor visits, and no legal documents processed in her name. She could disappear without triggering a single institutional alarm. Her disappearance was not dramatic. There was no 911 call, no apartment crime scene, no media attention. There was only a torso found in a field on a humid July morning and filed away under a date. Cold case detectives and forensic genealogists didn't bring Vivian back, but they made her visible again. That distinction matters. At the press conference, Cheryl Moss stood beside a new headstone. It bore her grandmother's name, her birth year, and the year she died. For the first time since 1981, the family knew where she was. The remains had been formally reinterred the week prior, with all county records updated. The original grave, once marked by a basic plastic stake with a number, was now clean, recorded, and locatable. A record no longer just for the dead, but for the living who had once waited. Forensic genealogy played a decisive role in this resolution. The use of public DNA databases, voluntarily contributed by civilians, had become one of the few investigative tools capable of reopening decades-old cases with no surviving suspects. In Vivian's case, it worked not by identifying the killer, but by identifying the victim, and thus transforming a silent file into a human story. In law enforcement reports, Vivian's case is categorized under unresolved with victim identification. For the public, the story functioned differently. It became an example of how long systems can fail to notice someone missing, and how determined people, analysts, relatives, detectives, can still break through that silence. The media coverage following the case's conclusion was measured. Regional outlets focused on the cold case breakthrough. National crime programs noted the forensic advances. But there was no viral moment, no courtroom clip, no mugshot, because some stories don't end with handcuffs. Some end with the correct name on a certificate of death. Investigators involved in the Moss case confirmed that the most likely suspect, Eric L. Mitchell, had died in 2010. His vehicle type matched the fiber evidence. His prior domestic abuse history, his proximity to the disposal site, his known connection to Moss, all consistent with probability, but not proof. He never confessed. No physical remains of the crime scene ever surfaced. No one ever came forward to place him with her in the final days. In criminal justice, that absence is absolute. Still, no part of this process was wasted. Every fragment of evidence tested, every interview revisited, every name recorded, all of it added up to the reassembly of a life that had been deliberately erased. Dismemberment is not just a physical act. In many cold cases, it's metaphorical, stripping a person of context, of history, of their presence in the world. Naming someone, properly, officially, and with verification, is a way of restoring what was taken. The Moss case has since been referenced in cold case training units throughout California as a procedural example of how forensic genealogy can succeed even in the absence of prosecutable evidence. More importantly, it has shaped how future unidentified victim cases are prioritized. Funding for DNA backlog reduction, particularly for cases involving marginalized victims, received a legislative boost within months of Moss's identification. This is the kind of change that doesn't make headlines but shifts entire processes, quietly, permanently. In the end, the Moss investigation didn't produce a courtroom drama. It produced something quieter, but perhaps more essential. Accountability not in the form of punishment, but in the form of remembrance. Justice is not a binary, solved or unsolved. In cold cases, especially those involving the forgotten, it's layered. It's what happens when a file becomes a name, when a number becomes a person again, and when the final act of violence is answered not with vengeance, but with documentation that says, "We saw her. We remembered." Vivian Moss was not forgotten. She was reclaimed. Sometimes justice doesn't come in the form of a trial or a verdict. Sometimes it's just about making sure someone's name is spoken out loud again, correctly and without forgetting. I share this story not to reopen wounds, but to remind us all, no one deserves to vanish without a trace. If you're watching this, I hope you carry forward this truth, that even when systems fail, people can still make a difference. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe identifying a victim after decades brings a form of justice? Drop a comment. I'd love to hear where you're watching from or how this story made you feel. If this video resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next story we uncover together.